Good afternoon, this is Germar Rudolf. Today I will be addressing a question that I have received from the French revisionist Robert Faurisson. And this is going to be my first video that I will dedicate to answering questions that I receive, since I cannot always answer questions in writing. 12 days ago, Robert sent me an email saying, "Dear Germar, I need your help. I do not understand the position of Fritz Berg. The question seems to me, is there or is there not a danger of explosion with hydrogen cyanide?" He opines here that there clearly is. And the background of this question is that he has been in a times vitriolic exchange with the American revisionist Friedrich Berg about the question of whether or not hydrogen cyanide is explosive and under which circumstances, and if there have been a danger of explosion during the claimed gassings of Jews during the Third Reich in homicidal gas chambers, particularly at Auschwitz. Now, the start of this controversy has been the expert report by American expert for execution technology Fred Leuchter, which was submitted to a court in Toronto in 1988. I have an early copy of this here, and he has addressed that issue. Now, hydrogen cyanide, for those who are not familiar with it, is the active ingredient in Zyklon B, which is the infamous product that is said to have been used to mass murder people at the Auschwitz camp. And hydrogen cyanide is a very toxic chemical, toxic both for insects and for warm-blooded animals, for mammals, and humans in particular. So there's no question about its toxicity. However, the question has been, how dangerous is it when it comes to its ability to explode if mixed with air and if it is being ignited. In his Leuchter report, Fred Leuchter wrote on page 12 of this issue a table listing all the chemical and physical features, not all, but some of them, of hydrogen cyanide. And it says there, under point 6, flammable limits in air, volume percent. Lower limit 6%, upper limit 41%. However, 3 pages later, he makes a mistake when he writes that the lower explosion limit of the gas-air mixture is 0.32%, which is the mixture that is usually used or has been used over many decades in United States execution gas chambers, applying the same chemical, even though a different procedure. I get to that later. Now, I assume just here that he made a mistake accidentally entering the average concentration and concentration used in the US execution gas chambers for the explosion limit. But that is unclear. However, later on he repeatedly refers to the danger of explosion and gives the impression that this low limit, accidentally given low limit of 0.32%, is actually what is the lower explosion limit, which would be wrong. On page 18 of this report of this edition, he writes in particular, "The adjacent crematories are a potential danger of explosion," meaning that near to the homicidal gas chambers that have been claimed in Auschwitz were cremation furnaces, at least in some of them, as they have been located in crematories. And the vicinity of these cremation furnaces to the claimed homicidal gas chamber, according to Fred Leuchter, posed a danger of explosion. Fritz Berg, the American engineer and revisionist, contends this and says there's not really a danger of explosion, since all the manuals in this regard state clearly, and he's correct in this regard, that if the proper amount of hydrogen cyanide is used, there's virtually no danger of explosion, meaning that the actual applied concentration is well below those 6% from which onward hydrogen cyanide can explode in air. Now, I have addressed this issue a number of times already early on. The first time was briefly in my own expert report, which was published for the first time 5 years after the Leuchter report. I've got the German original edition here, and on page 38 I explain that the limits of explosion of hydrogen and cyanide on air is between 6 and 41% again. That is always to be found in expert literature. And it says when there is a strong initial ignition, mixtures of that kind have an explosivity that is comparable to that of nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin, sorry. Now, nitroglycerin is the effective component in what's called dynamite. In other words, the effects of explosions of hydrogen cyanide in air, if between those 6 and 41%, can get comparable to explosions caused by dynamite. So it's nothing to trifle with. However, as Fritzberg correctly pointed out, delousings normally, the Zyklon B was designed as an insecticide, a fumigant to kill lice, bugs, rats, beetles, fleas, and so forth. And the recommended concentration for that usually doesn't exceed 1 to 2%. Under certain circumstances it can even be lower, but that's the recommended concentration that is not to be exceeded, and if that value, that threshold value is observed, there's virtually no danger of explosion. Now that is fumigations. It's a completely different thing than when talking about homicidal gassings, and I get to that next. Now, I think it was even Fritzberg who, several years after the publication of the first edition of my expert report, sent me a source indicating how dangerous explosions of hydrogen cyanide in air indeed can be by sending me a copy of an article that had appeared in Life magazine, and I referred to the first time my second edition of the German expert report that appeared in 2001, referring to Life magazine. I actually managed to get a real copy, a mint quality copy from eBay, the December 22nd, 1947 issue. We see there on page 31 the case of a fumigation of a house. There's a big image here showing how that house has been wrapped up, sealed up, and there is a hydrogen cyanide container on the sidewalk there, and it is connected to the house with some hoses, so they're pumping hydrogen cyanide into the house. And unfortunately they did too much, because that is what happened a short while later. The whole thing blew up. So the house was filled with obviously more than 8%, that's at least 3 times, 4 times, 5 times as much than should have been used, of hydrogen cyanide, forming apparently throughout much of the house explosive mixtures which blew up due to some ignition, probably from a light switch or whatever went wrong. Blew up the whole house. So that's the effect of hydrogen cyanide explosion, similar to what we would expect from dynamite explosion. The same can also be found in the first English edition of my expert report, which is more accessible to most viewers of this video. And I refer into the first edition of 2003. I described that on page 157. The same thing that is also pointed out in the German edition, also referring to the explosion as it reported in Life magazine. I have criticized the mistakes that Lüchter made in his report in the critical edition of the Lüchter reports. The first edition came out in 2005, and there we can read on page, what is this here, 33, where he repeats the lower explosion limit of the gas-air mixture of 0.32. I have footnote 61 there. Numerical error, as this should be 6%, so I have corrected that here. And then later on, he goes into the fact that hydrogen cyanide can actually produce very high volumes, up to varying percentages of concentration at air up to 100% close to the carrier. And I've also addressed that here in a footnote saying that it's indeed the fact that close to the carrier material, high concentrations of hydrogen cyanide will prevail, and that will be within the explosion limits for a certain period of time if there is not a strong air circulation that applies, that dissipates the gas throughout the location we're talking about. And then about Fred Riester's claim that adjacent crematories are a potential danger of explosion. I've addressed that on page 38. The current 4th edition, actually, it's also on the page 38, even though it's a different footnote number. And I write here, since a minimum of 60,000 ppm, that's 6% of hydrogen cyanide, is required to form an explosive mixture, but the applied concentration could in average hardly reach such values, and also because the ovens were in considerable distance from the gas chamber, there was no real danger of explosion. Now this is something I would explain a little bit in a little bit more detail, and we'll go into this by looking into the difference that we have between the delousing fumigations on the one hand and the claimed homicidal executions as they are said to have happened during the Third Reich in those chemical slaughterhouses. Let's look first at the evidentiary basis that we have, the actual evidence. There are two sets of evidence. First, hard evidence that we know about how gassings work and how they don't work. And the only hard evidence we have are based on actual documented gassings with hydrogen cyanide, which have occurred over decades, over the past century in the United States. A number of states in the United States had their capital punishment performed by using homicidal gas chambers. The best documentation about that has appeared, I think in 2010, a book by Scott Christensen, The Last Gasp, The Rise and Fall of the American Gas Chamber. I've printed out the title image of that book here, and if you type into YouTube Scott Christensen, The Last Gasp, you will actually even get a presentation there that he gave at some point, and it was recorded, I think it was in 2011. You can get a glimpse into his research. Now the nice thing about it is that Christensen went through the records of hundreds of executions and reported the data he could get from it, and a lot of it shows how long it took to actually execute, to kill the executees. And I've compiled those, and I will probably publish that in a new edition which is coming out hopefully within the year. And it shows that there is a good average value of around 9 to 10 minutes that it takes in those gas chambers to execute prisoners. There are some extreme cases that go beyond that into 12, 15, even 18 minutes, but they're the exceptions. There are also, of course, exceptions to the other direction where people die much faster. Now, looking at the situation as it was in those gas chambers, there's an explanation necessary, because there's a difference between the homicidal gassings that have occurred in the United States as capital punishment and what is claimed for the Third Reich period. Now, in my expert report, both English and German edition, the very first page of both of them start by talking about executions in the United States. And the very first page has a schematic drawing that shows the rough setup of homicidal gas chambers in the United States. They are not all that much different, even though there were a number of them with slight design differences. Now, this is the chair here where the defendant is sitting, and underneath him there is a pot crucible where sodium or potassium cyanide, a salt in pellet form, is put, and then slightly diluted sulfuric acid is added to it, which leads to the swift development of hydrogen cyanide gas, which is released into the air. It rises up, engulfs the titany within seconds, and exposes him initially to a very high concentration of hydrogen cyanide. Later on it dissipates through the chamber and it gets diluted, but initially the concentration is well above the later average concentration of 0.32%. So close to that container where this hydrogen cyanide develops, and initially the hydrogen cyanide gas rising up to the inmate has concentrations that is considerably beyond those 0.32, and most certainly also beyond the 6% volume, the explosion limit. So close to the source we have definitely concentrations that can be explosive, will be explosive. If there were any ignition spark in that area during an execution, it would lead to a minor explosion in that area. Now, switching to executions as they are said to have happened during the Third Reich era. This is a different issue. First of all, it is not claimed that sodium cyanide salt or potassium cyanide salt was used in that case, but rather Zyklon B. Zyklon B is gypsum granules of the size pea size or a little bigger that are soaked with liquid hydrogen cyanide. So it's not a cyanide salt, but it is already hydrogen cyanide. It is soaked in that gypsum carrier. And if a can of Zyklon B, of this soaked gypsum, is opened, it immediately starts evaporating, so you don't have to add anything. But the evaporation process initially is rather slow. So right at the beginning, the first waft is quite intense, and then it slows down, and it can take up to 1 or 2 hours for the entire hydrogen cyanide content to evaporate, depending on circumstances, on temperature, humidity, and other factors, in particular if there is any air movement that dissipates the gas. So Zyklon B has a completely different behavior than the method used in the US gas chambers, where the gas was released almost instantaneously once it was triggered with the sulfuric acid. Secondly, we look at the data we have for the alleged executions. I have collected early on for my expert reports information on what is claimed about the duration of the execution process. And I've done research for a number of other contributions looking into eyewitness accounts, which all led me to collect information of what eyewitnesses claim. And I've come to a very long list. It's one footnote that spans over an entire page of some 20 or 30, or even 40 in the meantime, eyewitness accounts making statements about how long it took to execute those victims in those Nazi gas chambers. And most of them are in the area of very short periods of time. Sometimes we have statements like moments, instantaneously, within the blink of an eye. But then again, we have few minutes, 3 minutes. And what I found is most eyewitness accounts talk about a very short period of times within a few minutes, 5 minutes, maybe up to 10 minutes. There are only a very few that talk about times that were longer than 10 minutes. So we are seeing here times that are comparable to what we see in single executions in the United States, which have lasted from a very short, a few minutes up to 15 minutes or 20 minutes. But on the other hand, in the United States, we have always single prisoners that have been executed, whereas in those German gas chambers, hundreds, if not thousands of people are said to have been executed. And under these circumstances, you have to assume that you need to kill every single one of them, even the one that lasts longest, that is toughest, that is withstanding for a number of reasons, whatever they may be, longer than an average person, as we see it on occasion in US executions. So if you wanted to achieve execution times in the minute range, a few minute range, that means you would have to expose everyone in that gas chamber, all the hundreds or even 1,000 or more inmates, to concentrations that are well beyond what US prisoners undergoing capital punishment in that way have been exposed in US gas chambers. So that means Zyklon B releasing hydrogen cyanide slowly within the first 5 to 10 minutes, some maybe 10%. If we want to achieve high concentrations right away, that means we need to put 10 times the amount into that chamber to begin with than the nominal amount that we have in the Zyklon B, because only 10% of that evaporates in that period of time. Next, even if it has evaporated within 10 minutes, that doesn't mean it has dissipated to the people that are standing farthest away in some corner of that alleged gas chamber. Fact is that eyewitnesses agree there has been no technical installation in any of the claimed homicidal gas chambers that would have accelerated the evaporation of hydrogen cyanide and accelerated the dissipation. All claims go to say basically that the Zyklon B was either dumped through holes in the wall or in the ceiling on the floor amidst the prisoners, or that it was actually lowered in some can within some column, which would be even worse in our scenario because that would slow down the evaporation extremely. Under any circumstances, the sophisticated devices that the Germans had developed already before the war and produced in mass during the war, that were used for fumigations, where Zyklon B was exposed to a hot air stream produced by hot air fan, going through it, blowing the hydrogen cyanide into the room, and then with a circulation device circulating the air around the disinfestation room, dissipating it swiftly. None of this is said to have been built into this so-called homicidal gas chamber. So what we have here is a scenario of very few sources of Zyklon B, from where everything had to evaporate by itself and dissipate by whatever movement there was in the room. There was no further assistance. Meaning, in order to kill also the last and toughest prisoner standing in the most remote corner of that room, you would have to apply an extreme overdose of Zyklon B. Not just the tenfold amount that I initially mentioned, because only 10% evaporate initially, but you have to increase that to compensate for the swiftness of the execution that is faster on average than in the United States, and for the distance people are standing in the chamber. So you come up easily with an amount that may be 100 times than the nominal amount usually used to effect that kind of an execution in the United States gas chamber. Meaning, we need to have close to the source of Zyklon B an extreme concentration that dissipates out by itself because of its high value to distant corners swiftly. And that means that we have around those sources of hydrogen cyanide, around those points where the Zyklon B had been dumped in, concentrations of that product that are well within the explosion limits of hydrogen cyanide. Not just close to the carrier, but it had to be to some distance away, let's say 10 feet or so around that area. 10 feet maybe an extreme, maybe 3, 4, 5 feet. Anyway, you have a considerable volume of air around those sources that would have had explosive mixtures in order to achieve the testified short execution times under the circumstances as claimed. So, an initial ignition strong enough would lead to an explosion. However, we're talking here about, the Germans call it Verpuffung, so you have a local explosion only, which leads to a sudden spike in air pressure. It wouldn't blow up a massive structure completely, as we've seen it in the Life magazine article, but it most certainly would suffice to blow out windows and doors if there are any in that structure, and there would have been, depending on what structure we're talking about. There is not documented any kind of massive steel doors for any of these facilities, which is another problematic issue in that connection, because massive steel doors capable of locking in panicking crowds would have been required, but there's no proof for it. And if there had been somebody in that gas chamber having, for instance, a ring like I'm wearing it here, a wedding ring, that wasn't taken away from them when they came into the camp. Usually it was, but there are a lot of testimonies saying how people were smuggling in stuff and were smuggling this and that around. So someone in there in the gas chamber striking a spark, and if only by falling when collapsing due to the poisoning, scraping down a concrete wall, which it all was there, concrete or brick wall, could create a spark that would have led to a local explosion, blowing out doors, shutters, windows in that room. Now, the other question is, would the cremation ovens have posed the risks that were in the vicinity? Again, under normal circumstances, if we're talking about a fumigation, the limits of hydrogen cyanide, the concentration of hydrogen cyanide would have been considerably lower than the explosion limits. And unless you throw Zyklon B right next to a stove, you wouldn't have had a risk of blowing yourself up. However, here we're talking about high concentration within the gas chamber that would have been rising after everybody was dead, because there was just so much Zyklon B in there to affect this swift execution that would have continued given off hydrogen cyanide, increasing the concentration, unless any ventilation system would have been able to deal with that and reduce it. But we're talking about crematorium 2 to 5 in Birkenau. They had their rooms with the furnaces well away in a distance from the claimed gas chambers. In the case of crematorium 2 and 3, they were actually on a different level and were connected through a hallway and a small elevator to the furnace room, and then you still had some distance to go to the furnaces. And considering that the alleged clay gas chambers, they had ventilation system that probably would have sucked out a good amount of extreme concentrations, I don't think it is likely that any high pockets of concentration would have been able to reach through the hallway, up the elevator, into the hall, into the furnace. That is rather unlikely. Similar in crematorium 4 and 5, even though it was all on one level, the claimed homicidal gas chambers were at one end of the buildings, the oven rooms, the furnace rooms were at a different end, and there was a hallway and a big corpse hall and a separation wall, room between them. So these extreme kind of concentrations of more than 6% managing to go through all the building to the other end is extremely unlikely that this would have happened. They would have had to open all the doors, set the whole building under gas, which would be a little bit counterproductive to the operation of the whole facility. So now that can be excluded. So for these crematoria in Birkenau, I say no. However, the one exception is the crematorium, the old crematorium at the Auschwitz main camp, where the morgue, the homicidal gas chamber, was right next and parallel to the furnace room, and they were connected with one doorway that, according to the blueprints we have, even one of April 1942, had only a door that was swinging right through, and such a door could not possibly be made gas tight, not even panic proof against crowds in there. So this door is, of course, already a strong argument against that room ever having been a homicidal gas chamber. But under these circumstances, if you were to throw in a lot of Zyklon B in that room, in that morgue, to kill a lot of people very swiftly, then you could have had concentrations there right next to the room that could have gotten into the furnace room, and they're close to the furnaces, and that would have been a risk. Maybe not very high, but there is a considerable risk. The setup in that location was very, very dangerous indeed, in case that would have been tried. Now, I've shown in a different documentation, a presentation that I've given just 2 or 3 weeks ago with Dr. Fatzer on the new book by Martonio, Created Lies, about the various arguments against that room ever having been a homicidal gas chamber at the old crematorium at the Auschwitz main camp. So if you're interested, you may want to watch that. It goes into more details. The explosivity issue is another, but more of a footnote remark that would make the whole claim of that place being used as a homicidal gas chamber incredible, unlikely. But it is not the strongest argument. But in that context, in that particular context, I would say Robert François is right. With that kind of setup, that's too risky. I wouldn't have risked it as a potential executioner to have my gas chamber right next to the furnace room and to have a technically extremely primitive setup in that claimed gas chamber to execute people by just throwing in Zyklon B, not being able to retrieve it, it giving off gas in quantities that would have reached and exceeded explosion limits at times, and through that primitive door the room had to be open at some point in order to cremate those bodies, and the ventilation device, the ventilation system in that room was actually pretty much a disaster. There's documentation about that it wasn't even up to properly airing a morgue, let alone a homicidal gas chambers with extreme amounts of poison gas in it. So, to summarize, when it comes to fumigations, if done properly, the danger of explosion is so minute, unless you bungle it completely, as we've seen in this this article in Life magazine, that you can ignore the danger of explosions. But that's fumigations. When it comes to homicidal gasings, it's a different issue. Again, two different sets we have to distinguish. The United States execution gas chambers, they had a limited problem with just one, or in extreme cases they had the opportunity, but I don't think they ever did, or maybe they did, to execute two people at once. But the system there was completely different. They had the gas valving directly underneath the detainee, engulfing them directly, and the technically sophisticated setup to prevent problems. On the other hand, we have the claimed German system, which, even though they were technically advanced when it came to fumigation, where they used proper technology, they're said to have used basically no technology at all, just throw in and forget. And that technically primitive process is supposed to have resulted in very swift mass murder, conveyor belt mass murder, which is already a jarring contradiction. Because in order to achieve that quick execution of a lot of people in a big room, you would have had to have a technical setup of quickly evaporating and dissipating, but it's not claimed to. But if you want to make those two things, those two statements fit, a lot of people killed swiftly without proper technology, you would have to overcompensate by throwing a lot of Zyklon B. And at the end of the day, only experiments could verify how much you have to throw in there for it to work reliably. It's not really possible. But I have the feeling, the gut feeling actually, those many eyewitness testimonies that talk about instantaneous, momentarily, few minutes, they are technically not possible under any circumstances, because with the Zyklon B you just can't achieve the release of huge amounts, anticipation of huge amounts of hydrogen cyanide as would be required to kill that swiftly. So the low end time claims of those executions are just untrustworthy, basically wrong to begin with. But even if you go to the ones that are a little longer, you still need extreme amounts of hydrogen cyanide in the air to achieve that. And then you get into the area where you have the danger of explosion, because there was no technology installed in those claimed chemical slaughterhouses to achieve what the witnesses claimed to have been achieved in the period of time claimed. For me, that settles the issue. There is never a 100% clear answer to anything when it comes to hypothetical scenarios for which we have no hard evidence, no documentary evidence whatsoever. We have only anecdotal evidence, which is at times contradictory, at times technically impossible, and which puts us in a place where we have to speculate to some degree. Science normally says you have to be able to replicate things in order to come to safe conclusions and to make sure that what you have done can be reproduced by others. Of course, that's not really possible. The only data we have, reliable data, is the US executions, and they point to the fact that what is claimed for the German Nazi time executions is not really within the technical feasible. That is enough for today. I hope that settles the issue. At least that is my contribution to it, and for me that settles it. So I'm not going to get into that issue anymore unless I'll be presented with some new information that then makes me revise my own position. Thank you for watching me today, and I hope I see you again when I will pick up the next question that I will have, which may be David Irving's take on the Aktion-Reinhardt camps, an issue raised recently a number of times, and that is going to be the topic of my second video. Thank you, and I hope to see you again.